Thank you for joining us for the final session of today's Thought Leadership. By way of introduction, my name is Johan Hanekom, and like you, I'm passionate about technology and innovation. Part of my role is to look at emerging technologies that we can co-develop and then launch with visionary entrepreneurs that are set to change the way industries work. I've been invested in this career trajectory for the last 25 years. I actually had my own business for many years, manufacturing agricultural products, which I scaled and sold to a private equity firm. I then worked in private equity for about 10 years, working with startups, helping them scale their businesses, applying best practices. And then I made the decision to work for large corporates because I wanted to understand what happens to these startups and scale-ups once they're part of a large organization. And that led me to Amazon, where I led sustainability and innovation for Amazon Web Services for a 3-year period. And in my current role, I'm the CEO of Ascari Ventures. We're a private equity fund working with entrepreneurs who are looking to disrupt industries through innovative technology, specifically aimed at agriculture, manufacturing, and construction. Today's talk will focus on a concept that we call garage thinking. It's something that we look for in the entrepreneurs that we work with, and it's this notion of simple ideation and innovation within a business, regardless of its size. And we'll be using some examples today looking at the likes of Amazon, and Apple, Google, etc., to see which of these concepts are a golden thread that runs through their innovation culture. But more importantly, and you'll hear these themes as well today, is to break it down into 3 fairly simple concepts. The first one being leadership principles. So there are leadership principles that each of these innovative companies have. Secondly, we'll be looking at team structures. How do they structure their teams? And again, it's a very nuanced but deliberate way in which they do it. And then last but not least, we'll be looking at what kind of mechanisms they use to surface great ideas. And most importantly, also kill off ideas that are no longer profitable or that no longer delight the customer. Before I kick off, I want to start with a bit of a backstory on a brand that I think most of us are familiar with. Apple will be a 50-year-old brand next year. It's incredible to think that they've had this very humble beginning, having started in a garage, 2 guys who wanted to transform the world of computing in a time where the concept was still quite nascent and new. But there's actually a very interesting backstory to the founding of Apple. Does anyone know who this particular gentleman is on the far right of the screen? So he's actually one of the co-founders of Apple, right? So he started Apple with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The 3 of them were actually work colleagues, and Ronald, in the picture, came to Steve Jobs to say, I've seen you work in our office, and I think there's more to you than just being an employee at Atari. We should think about starting a business together. And so the 2 of them decided that they were going to start Apple. So Steve Jobs at that time was 21 years old. Ronald Wayne was 41 years old. And Steve actually said to Ronald, I have another work colleague that I would love to bring into this endeavor. His name is Steve Wozniak. Very, very technical guy, brilliant with his ideas. The 3 of us should start a business. And so they started Apple Inc. And about 2 weeks after founding Apple, Ronald had a bit of a second thought about this endeavor. So he had had some successes and failures in his past, nearly went out of business after launching a failed slot machine business, and after careful consideration, said to the Steves, look, I'm pulling out of this. I'm going to sell my shares back to you. So he had 10% equity of Apple at the time, and he sold it back to them for $800. If you look at what Apple's market cap is today, it's about $3.5 trillion. So that's arguably one of history's greatest investments that never came to be. And it would have made him one of the richest people on planet Earth had he held onto his shares. It would have been worth about $350 billion. Not that money is a metric of success, but it's a wake-up call looking at these startups that are high potential but misunderstood. And he seems to have had this track record of identifying great opportunities but not really cannibalizing on them, because in the late 2000s, he sold the partnership agreement between him and the two Steves for $500, and 5 years later, it got resold for $1.6 million. So, you know, it's a lesson around spotting opportunity and then really seizing it and converting it. And the beautiful story is that it started in a garage, right? And we'll see some of these themes around this garage thinking where great innovative ideas start off in very humble settings, a garage or a lab where you wouldn't necessarily think innovation would come from, but these great ideas have those humble beginnings. This is a bit of a thought exercise, and I just want you to spend 30 seconds just looking at the sentence. And if you've done this before, don't spoil the punchline, but look for how many of the letters F for Foxtrot you can read in this sentence. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to go through it. Okay. How many of you think that there are 3 Fs in this sentence? 3? Okay. So about 25%. Anyone have 5 Fs? Okay. And anyone have 6 Fs? Cool. All right. So the minority of you are right. It's actually 6 Fs. So when you reread the sentence, the letter F for Foxtrot appears 6 times in the sentence. You're all academically educated. I'm dyslexic, so I would lose out on this straight away. But it showcases how, even with an educated audience, under no time pressure, 30 seconds is enough to read the sentence, there was still a disagreement as to factually how many letters F are in the sentence. And it's just a thought exercise that we use to showcase that sometimes we may be looking at the same thing, have very different opinions on it. It doesn't make it right or wrong other than factually what is the case. Feel free to use this in one of your presentations with your boss one day just to throw them for a curveball. But it's a great way to spark conversation around differing opinions and then drilling down to figure out what is right. But coming back to the narrative of today, which is this concept of building a culture of innovation. And it ties back to Amazon's culture of innovation. It ties back to what we see at Apple, Google, Netflix. But more importantly, you should be thinking about how it ties back to your organization. So when you reflect on your own company, whether you're the owner or whether you're an employee, asking yourself, what kind of innovation culture do you have, if any? And as you go through this presentation, try and ask yourself, how many of these elements are there in your business? And most importantly, if there is a gap, how do you plan on overcoming that gap? Before we launch into some of the elements of what it takes to build a culture of innovation, it's very important to reflect on once great and innovative companies that are, for the most part, no longer with us. And this is just a very small constellation of brands that at one stage were considered household names, right? So bottom left, you've got what is now known as a VHS tape. We don't really use those anymore, but for those in the room that are younger than 20 years old, this was the original Netflix. So you'd go to the video store on a Friday for the latest release. You'd fight off other people to get your copy of that new movie. And you'd either be very happy on Friday night or totally disgusted with someone else taking your copy of Anaconda, you know, whatever the latest release was. But the interesting thing about Blockbuster was that they had the opportunity to buy Netflix in the early 2000s. So Reed Hastings and his co-founder went to Blockbuster to say, we've got a very interesting online video sharing platform that we've created, and we think you might be able to benefit from that. You've got a loyal customer base. They love to consume media. You have a bricks and mortar solution. Is there a way we could partner together? And of course, Blockbuster at the time felt that that was a ridiculous idea and that it would go nowhere. So they passed up on the opportunity to buy Netflix. And in 2010, Blockbuster went bust because guess what? Netflix took over. People loved the convenience of streaming. And the rest was history for Blockbuster. Taking into account Netflix originally was a physical solution as well. So I remember in 2008 when I lived in New York, you would order your movie from Netflix and it would get shipped to you via the mail. You'd watch it and then ship it back. And that was cumbersome, but it was kind of cool to know that you didn't have to wait in line for your film, right? Then they had these little boxes you could go to, and then that sort of came to an end, and eventually streaming took over. I did a podcast with the inventor of the digital camera, Stephen Sasson, a couple of weeks ago. Stephen Sasson worked for Kodak as a young graduate. And for those of you that don't know the history, feel free to watch the podcast or read up on it. It's fascinating. So he was a young grad. They didn't know what to do with him. They said to him, Stephen, take your time, come up with a novel, a new idea, and then once you're ready, come back to us with your solution. So about a year later, he figured out a way to take light and convert it into a digital solution. He didn't quite know what to call the solution, but when he presented it to the board, the first question they asked him was, so where does the film go in this digital product of yours? To which he honestly replied, it doesn't use any film, right? And that caused the management team to be disgusted with this idea because you're not promoting our core product, which is film. Heavily invested in, world-class at it, very successful company. And Stephen said, look, the future is digital, right? We have to pivot into this new market because it's complementary to what we currently offer. Long story short, he stayed with the organization for 36 years, desperately trying to convince management that the future is digital. And sadly, Kodak went out of business. In spite of the fact that they had the solution in-house. They had the opportunity to be a first mover, but they fell in love with their solution versus falling in love with the customer problem, which is, how do we keep our memories safe? It doesn't have to be in film. It can be in a digital format. We just want to know that that beautiful photo we've taken won't be lost forever. And part of the problem was also that heavily invested in film. So Kodak was world-class at film production, which is a very complex process. It requires a lot of upfront capital. So they had that economic moat protecting them. But what they didn't have was the fact that digital was going to start eroding that protected market share they had. Ironically, Kodak was a first mover when it came to color photography, when black and white was the standard. And they also had the world's first image sharing website in 2001. What they failed to do was to capitalize on the social aspect of image sharing. We now know that as Instagram, right? So Kodak had something very similar where you could upload your photo, you could have it printed, you could share it with others, but it lacked the social aspect, which was a very nuanced space to find oneself in. Nokia, for those of you that still have a Nokia at home somewhere in a drawer, you can probably switch it on, the battery will still be working. The stuff is bulletproof. Incredible product. Nokia at one stage had 50% global market share of all cell phones, right? That is an impressive statistic even by today's standards. Yet, in spite of that, they lacked a comfortable user interface and, in hindsight, a management team that was customer obsessed. So even though Microsoft bought Nokia for their intellectual property around their hardware, what they failed to be able to do was delight customers with a variety of apps, which we now know is we're an app-driven culture, and also the user face, more so than the hardware, but the user interface. So in spite of Microsoft, one of the Magnificent Seven, acquiring Nokia, 2 years later, they basically wrote off the acquisition as a tax deductible. So here you've got a great company, fantastic hardware, but unable to delight the customer. MySpace launched in 2001, the world's first social media site, and a first mover. Facebook was launched a year after MySpace. MySpace is no more. The critical mistake that they made was to try and monetize customers too quickly, right? The whole foundational value of social media is the social part of it. You want to feel you're part of a digital community, you're able to tap into that community, build networks. But MySpace, because of their investment structure, were too quick to want to monetize it. So Facebook came in and said, we've got a long-term vision. There's a huge market share to be enjoyed here. And last but not least, Yahoo, who were the world's first search engine, first mover advantage, got to know the customer better than the competition, and they were in a very privileged position actually to buy Google for the grand total of $1 million, right? So Google was struggling to raise capital. Their method for search and their approach to search was radically different to Yahoo. And Yahoo really didn't see the value in buying Google. 5 years later, Yahoo had to go back to Google to say, we now would like to buy you, And Google said, look, if we had to make a price, it's probably $3 billion. But to be frank with you, your vision is too small for search. We've got a whole bigger vision we want to develop. So the nature of competition and the nature of leaders and laggards can shift very quickly. Just because you're a big deal today does not mean you've got any right to be here tomorrow. And this is why the title says you're not too big to fail, right? And there will be more household names that we think of and know of today that will be added to this list. Maybe Amazon, maybe Apple, who knows? Nothing stops those companies from becoming laggards if they fail to continue innovating. We're going to have a 1-minute break, looking at a quick video, and then we'll jump back into the presentation.
I started in June of 1995. We needed a desk, and we were operating on a shoestring budget. Jeff Bezos had walked across the street, bought a door and a 4x4, and built the first door desk.
We had to find ways to get things done without spending a lot of money. So it was just more out of survival and making sure we had enough money to pay our paychecks.
Door desk is a solid core door held up by 4 4x4 legs and some metal brackets to hold it together. There was only 1 or maybe 2 desks that Jeff Bezos had made, and they were pretty wobbly. You would never want to hire Jeff Bezos as a carpenter. He's much better at other things. I think he'd tell you the same thing.
In the later years, the desk really started to become a focal point of Amazon culture.
I think it's taken on a symbolic status. The philosophy of frugality at Amazon is when you have a problem, find the easiest, more straightforward, and least expensive way to solve it.
I have a couple, one in the garage, and then I took one and chopped it down and made 3 desks. 2 of them are my kids' school desks they use to do homework on. They know that this is Amazon history and part of the Amazon culture.
There you go. Got yourself a door desk.
Cool. So that is still very much institutionalized in Amazon, right? So we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into Amazon and its culture of innovation. In spite of the fact that Amazon generates $1 million a minute, right, which is a staggering amount, 365 days a year, 24 hours around the clock, this concept of frugality is very much core to the business because ultimately it's about creating value for the end customer. And if we look at the founding story behind Amazon, so here's this guy, Jeff Bezos, very successful individual who decides that he wants to pivot into e-commerce, which back in 1994 was still a very small new industry. And he left the business, started Amazon.com, and a year later, they were running out of money. So Amazon was going to go bankrupt because, by his own admission, they'd exhausted the first round of funding, which is family, friends, and fools, and now had to look at institutional investors that were going to be far more rigorous in terms of what they look for in their investment. And so Jeff goes and pitches Amazon.com to about 50 institutional investors, and these were not casual conversations. These were hardcore pitches that they had prepared for, warm introductions they had. So they'd gone through all the hurdles to get to these meetings. And of those 50 investors, about 20 said, we'd be happy to invest because you're a convincing guy. We don't know so much about the internet. In fact, for some of these investors, they had never heard of the internet. It was such a new idea that for certain investors, it was an academic exercise to show interest in the internet. And in exchange, they could invest in Amazon at $50,000 per investment. So for $1 million, you could get 20% equity in Amazon, valuing it at about $5 million. Again, a fantastic investment for any one of those shareholders. Amazon right now is about $2.5 trillion company, give or take. But one of the things that Jeff really wanted to solidify was this notion of we need to stay agile, we need to think and act like a startup. So you'll often hear Amazonians talking about Amazon as being a constellation of startups. Very rarely would Amazon refer to itself as a large corporate. In fact, they would prefer to deny that because it's more comfortable working in an environment where you are considered a smaller player versus being the dominant player in that space. And in order to facilitate that, the thinking in Amazon is very much based around small, agile teams. And within Amazon, they're known as 2-pizza teams. So when you join Amazon, you work within multiple two-pizza teams who have been tasked with a business outcome. So project management within Amazon is not a very popular concept, but the idea of being a product manager is. So can you, as a single-threaded owner, build a solution with, let's say, 6 to 8 people that is specific to your deliverable, right? And can you do it on your own with a set budget? There is a level of cooperation in the organization, but the notion is very much that if you have a business opportunity, build your dream team that can deliver that outcome. And that way, there is no finger pointing to blame others if your idea does not come to fruition. So there's a lot of autonomy within Amazon, but it does come with the additional penalty of having to take full ownership of the process, right? And in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about these product managers and what we look for in them in terms of the skill sets. But just jumping back into leadership principles. So Amazon has about 16 leadership principles that are used to guide everyday activities and actions. It's not just against the mural where you casually glance at it every now and then. They are very much in every conversation, in every email. And for those of you that do business with Amazon, you should hold them accountable to these leadership principles. And they are designed to be conflicting. So 2 of them are, one's think big, and the other one is bias for action. Now, if you think about thinking big and bias for action, there's a little bit of a complement there. But if you then throw in the third leadership principle, which is dive deep. So how can I showcase bias for action and dive deep on a topic, especially something like artificial intelligence that's very complex? And so these leadership principles are designed to create healthy tension with regards to debate. One of the other leadership principles is have backbone, disagree, and commit. So if you and your colleague, one's showing bias for action, the other one is recommending diving deep on a topic, if there's a difference of opinion, that's good, and you can settle it through having a vigorous debate in a respectful manner, and then, most importantly, committing, right? This is in the absence of commitment, you're just going to be stagnant. So we have these 2 pizza teams that are decentralized. They have a single-threaded owner. You have the leadership principles that you use to guide your activities and day-to-day actions. But most importantly, how do we continue surfacing these great ideas? So in Amazon's case, they have a press release with frequently asked questions. It's one of their methods that they use, along with working backwards. There's a whole book titled Working Backwards. So starting with you as a customer, working backwards from the solution to determine what are the steps we need to take to get there. It sounds like, Innovation 101. How is this such a simple way for Amazon to conduct its business? But Amazon does not do PowerPoints. Not a single idea or business has ever been launched through PowerPoint within Amazon, ever. Right? And will never either. It is all about the written narrative, writing down your idea, becoming granular with it so that you may be a great public speaker, but how good is your idea fundamentally? And can we scrutinize it to determine where are the shortcomings? 2 of Amazon's ideas, one was a complete failure called the Amazon Fire Phone. Anyone own an Amazon Fire Phone? Launched in 2014. Amazon wanted to grab market share from this little company called Apple, because why should everyone have an Apple iPhone or an Android? Let's also grab the customer's attention, because ultimately Amazon wants to be part of your ecosystem from start to finish. And phones, as we all know, we love to look at them all day long. So can we integrate Amazon into the phone, voice recognition, basically make our entire existence around you? And so Amazon launched the Fire Phone, and it was a complete disaster. Customers hated it. It went through all of these rigorous processes, by the way. It was Jeff's idea, so it got pushed on a little bit further probably than it should have. But it backfired, and it was a complete failure. The phone was launched for $199.99, and 3 months later, it got marked down to 99 cents, basically being given away for free. And then 9 months after that, Amazon decided to discontinue it altogether, and they wrote off $170 million worth of stock, which for Amazon is small change. Right? That's not a big deal. But it's the fear of failure that followed after that that was the big concern for Jeff. So, okay, we tried something new, it didn't work, but that's part of what innovation requires, right? Failure and invention are inseparable twins. You have to accept the one in order to gain the other. And so when he was interviewed by the media and analysts and investors to share around the success story of the Fire Phone, or at least the failure of it, he was very quick to say that, look, yes, it was a failure, and I want to reassure you that we're currently working on even bigger failures within Amazon that will make the Fire Phone look like a very small failure. And that's all part of the process of building great products and services. We accept that in spite of our best efforts, we still may fail, but in the absence of which we're not innovating hard enough. And I think that's very courageous on the part of a leader to say, we accept that we failed at something, but it's not final. It's a learning opportunity if we make it one, and let's do it better next time around. Which brings me to Amazon Web Services. So Amazon Web Services was launched in 2006, and again, Wall Street was dead set against this idea that Amazon is going to pivot away from its core business, which is the online selling of books and other things. It now has 400 million other things on its website. But Jeff was convinced that this was the right thing to do, pivoting into an adjacent market where customers needed a better solution that was available. And so, in spite of the market being dead set against this idea, he pushed ahead. He was willing to be misunderstood for a long period of time. And if we fast forward 18 years, today AWS generates about $100 billion a year in revenue for Amazon, which is significant, right? From an idea that was shunned to now one that is truly celebrated. And within reason, AWS is on its way to becoming a $1 trillion business as a standalone entity, given the growth of cloud computing. So just two examples. There are hundreds of other examples within Amazon of failed products, Amazon Destinations, Amazon Wallet, certain elements of Amazon Robotics, etc. And that list will grow, but there are also lots of successes to reflect on. So what for you, though? What does that help you in your daily business? So the product manager persona, and this is just a very small constellation of some of the qualities that Amazon looks for in a product manager. These are very familiar concepts to you, but to highlight some of the key messages, it's really the last sentence, right? It's for the product manager to be the voice of the customer within the organization. Oftentimes, and we've all seen this in the boardroom, depending on the size of the ego of the person speaking, you tend to drift towards who is right versus what is right for the customer. And it's a very easy thing to fall into because no one likes to be wrong, right? We're not putting ourselves on stage or raising our hand in the boardroom because we want to be proven wrong. We prefer to be proven right. But it's important that that is in the spirit of what is right for the customer, right? Because ultimately the customer is the one that keeps the lights on. And so when Amazon looks at this product manager persona, I want to highlight two of these. So they have to represent the customer vision and the customer need. And customer needs evolve. So products and services that delighted us 3 years ago, 5 years ago, they no longer delight us in the same context. So it's staying current with what the customer needs are and feeding that to the organization so that it informs the strategy. And then as we see with the proliferation of artificial intelligence and other technologies, how are we managing our staff so that they are complemented by this evolution in the marketplace? Right? So in Amazon's case, about 5 years ago, Amazon doubled down on AI training before it was trendy. Amazon saw this curve coming its way and wanted to ensure that its employees are geared for it, that they've got the technical skills and also a respect for what this technology can do. One of the beautiful things that we have ahead of us, whilst we can't predict the future, is a notion that the global economy as it stands right now is probably going to double in size over the next 25 years. So right now, globally, the economy is about $107 trillion. So all the ideas in this room and in every other venue in the world added up together is about $107 trillion of economic opportunities. Over the next 25 years, that's going to double to about 227 trillion. So it's a staggering thought that our current world economy, another one of that is going to get created. So if you've got a $1 billion idea, it's a drop in the ocean against this metric. So it doesn't mean that it's not relevant. It just means that it's important to think big because we're accessing global opportunities. Whether you're in the UK, Singapore, Cape Town, New York, it doesn't matter. You've now got a global economy that you can tap into. And I think especially in the case of the UK and Europe, where we have this fear that we're not innovating quickly enough, I see a lot of stands here today with the words innovation on them. It's important to walk the talk around innovation. What are you doing that's truly different, radically different to what we see in this space? Or are you iterating in the safe zone, where it's 1% to 2% changes in what you do? That, unfortunately, is not good enough given how fast the rate of change is in the world. And especially seeing that you're not competing against your UK counterparts only. It's now a global competition base that you're dealing with, right? So thinking globally is not just a defense play, it's an offense play to say, how do we capture that market share? In summary, and I know that this has been a rapid drill down of some of the concepts related to innovation within Amazon and others. When you reflect on your own culture of innovation, ask yourself whether or not the team that you are in or the teams that you manage have the right mindset and culture. Most of the time, they don't, right? Which is why companies seek to try and build this culture of innovation. And it's fine to acknowledge it, because it's better to acknowledge it than ignore it, because in the absence of which you turn into a Kodak. Secondly, is enabling the teams for their mission. We see a lot of companies putting very brave statements out there to get their employees to do the impossible. And there isn't any supplemental training or any kind of professional development to enable them to do that objective, to complete that outcome. So looking at your skills development, looking at your HR policies, and truly asking yourself, are you providing people with the requisite knowledge and skills to achieve the success that you're expecting from them? This will be a familiar concept to most of you, but to become data-driven, measure it, monitor it, manage it, whether that's revenue, emissions, your innovation funnel, whatever it may look like, but to become very data-driven so that quantitatively you can discuss matters with one another versus saying, we're not innovating enough. Well, how do you measure that? How are we looking at our funnel? How many ideas have we killed off that are not productive? Are we clinging on to concepts that are 5 years old that are no longer relevant? Are we leaning into new things which are potentially going to shift the way we do business? And we have to get onto those trends now so we're not usurped. This is a hard one to get right, choosing the right project. In the majority of businesses, there are enough challenges to tackle. Very few businesses have limited to no challenges. Think about Amazon, millions of challenges to address, right? So how do you pick a opportunity that you can then develop with your team to showcase how this new way of thinking works or how a new technology can be deployed? That's really important to get right. And that's the burden of leadership that you have to have the guts to choose a project that gives everyone an opportunity to shine and also delivers value to the company. A fine balance to maintain. And then last but not least, looking at scaling. So how can you scale what you've created beyond your own geography that you find yourself in? Google has a great way of looking at this. So Google looks at, can we find one customer that has a need? Can we find 100,000 of those customers that have a similar need, then 1 million, then 10 million, etc.? Email being an example, something we all use to a lesser or greater extent. What else is there that every customer in this room needs that is currently not being created or being provided at a level that's sufficient? Lastly, just looking at the power of tiny gains. There is a rush to get things done in business, but I think it's important to scale it back down to small incremental changes can make a material difference. It's better to move in a slightly right trajectory than allow apathy to kick in and move slightly in the wrong trajectory, both of which have compounding effects. With that, I would love to open up to any questions that you've got. If you don't feel comfortable asking questions now, I'm available afterwards as well. You can just come up and grab me and ask away. Thank you.